My name's Monk Rowe for the Phileas Jazz Archive at Hamilton College. I'm very pleased to have Oliver Nelson Jr. with me on a nice afternoon for talking music. And congratulations on your career so far.
Thank you very much.
Make a living in the arts is a challenge, but also has some significant rewards, I would say.
Well, and it's interesting you bring that up because this is probably the best time of my life that doesn't make a lot of money. So,
Would you extrapolate on that?
oh yeah, let me give you a little history of me. I got my bachelor's degree in 1977 in music education. 20 years later, I got my master's degree in classical flute performance. I studied with the principal in the Indianapolis Symphony here. And then 19 years later, I decided to go back and get my doctorate at the University of Illinois, where I studied with Chip McNeil. So my career has been very varied. In between those times, I taught for 1 year in Indianapolis Public Schools. And I said, well, teachers don't make a lot of money. I need to do something else. So I went into the energy field. I didn't even know how to spell energy, Monk. So we were doing energy audits on different facilities around the state of Indiana. I did that for 5 years for the state. Then I worked for 12 years for the local gas utility, Citizens Gas here in Indianapolis. And they paid for me to get my master's in classical flute performance at Butler University here, which was really a blessing. It was really cool.
Wow.
Um,
You and I, not to get off the track, but I noticed you and I share a love of Hubert Laws.
oh yeah. And I actually did my doctoral paper on Hubert.
Mm.
And I've met him several times because he did a lot of work for Dad. He played on the Count Basie Afrique album. He played on an album called the Mayor Speaks, and Dad wrote a suite for strings and jazz orchestra, and Hubert played on that. Then he did some television stuff because he would go to LA and play. He actually played my first Bundy flute, and that was a real treat. So I got a chance to catch back up with him.
Yeah.
And actually, he was playing with the Smithsonian. That was a couple of years ago, and I got a chance to actually present my paper to him, and I gave him a copy of it. And he was really neat because he said, "Oh, this is one of the best papers on me that I've ever seen."
Oh, that's great.
So it was, and he's a beautiful player, but a beautiful cat.
Mm-hmm. That is a Wildflowers LP that I just think has got it all.
Oh yeah, it's interesting you bring the albums up because the first album I heard was Afro Classics, and this is, I think I was 14, 15 years old. My stepmother gave me a flute. I went into a closet and was hyperventilating trying to get a sound out of that thing. And after that, I said, well, and I looked at his life because he studied at Juilliard. So I said, and really you want to learn how to play the instrument well. Because once you do that, then you can go and do you can learn the language of jazz. So I started to take classical flute lessons, and I did that, and I came to Indianapolis. I studied with a guy named Albert Serini, who used to be principal of Indianapolis. And then I finally met Karen Moratz, who is the present principal now, and I got my master's with her. And then I wanted to get a doctorate, but IU didn't have a doctorate in jazz performance. So I went to the University of Illinois, and they let me in. So I was playing trumpet parts and stuff with the Latin Jazz Band for 3 years and had to transpose a lot of stuff.
Oh, transpose, boy.
Oh, yeah. So I had to do that a while, but it was probably the best experience of my life, Monk. It's interesting. We had a thing called a jazz forum at 11 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Well, I'm the oldest guy in the school. I'm probably older than the teachers when I went there. This is about 10 years ago. So I'm sitting there, and I had to pinch myself. I said, I'm sitting here listening and playing music, playing jazz, and guys my age just either hate their job and want to get out or try to retire. So it was a great experience. And my family was a little different then, too, because my kids had all grown up. My wife was actually working for the Army in Saudi Arabia. So Illinois was about 125 miles from home. So I got a little flea bag apartment. It really was a flea bag. But I drive back home on the weekends to make sure the house was okay. And then I went to fly over to see her several times.
Wow.
In the meantime. So my life has been kind of up and kind of interesting.
Yeah, you've paid some dues. If you went to a cocktail party and someone that you'd never met said, well, Mr. Nelson, what do you do for a living? You have a short answer?
Oh yeah, I am a full-time musician now,
Okay.
and I've always wanted to do that, but now I actually am because I'm teaching adjunct at IU. I'm teaching a jazz for listeners class, which is a introductory class for people that are not in jazz, know nothing about it at all. I taught a beginning jazz improv class, and we had people in there that couldn't play a blues scale, didn't know what a blues scale was, and all that kind of stuff, and that was really good. And then I teach a music industry class, and
Mm,
that class is interesting because what I found out, Monk, is most of the students have no clue of how the music business works. I mean, they can play their instruments really well, but I said, when you get out, how are you going to eat? You know, how are you going to pay your rent? How are you going to pay your car note? And some of them have no clue. And they would say, well, you know, Mr. Nelson, I play in the top orchestra at IU. I said, well, you know what? You're paying IU to play in that orchestra. You want somebody to pay you to play. So how are you going to make that happen? And some of them start to get it, but then it really kind of makes them think a little bit because schools do not do a good job of really letting students know what the real world of music is out here. And with COVID, it makes it that much
yes.
worse.
I know I have trouble. I've had trouble over the years trying to get my students to realize that they can't just play what they want to if they want to work. You know, you've got to be prepared for any situation, be able to
That's
take
right.
requests, and so it's tricky. I'm going to guess that you learned what the word gig meant early on in life.
Real early on in life. I've got a ton of stories to tell you about gigs and dad and all that kind of stuff. And I've probably seen more than most because I've seen great players scuffle to play his music. You
Hmm.
know, but he just sets it down there and you just got to count this stuff off and go. And it doesn't necessarily go all the time like you want it to go. But and then his career was really interesting too because he drove a streetcar in St. Louis for a while, um, but he always wanted to be into music. So eventually, he got in the Marines, learned music there, went back to Washington University, studied with a guy named Robert Wykes, who um, was also a flutist. Studied with Joseph Mariano at Eastman, but he also got his PhD in composition. So Dad really studied, and that was one of the big differences between him and a lot of jazz guys. He could write anything.
Hmm.
So Hollywood really prepared him because he had to write anything at any time for any producer based upon what he was working on at the time.
That came to mind today because I was listening to some of his themes, and you went from the $6 million man with all these sirens and all this, and then to the Virginian. Like all of a
Oh
sudden,
yeah,
we're going back like 100 years, and and it's sort of frontiery, and
oh yeah.
that's just so admirable.
Well, because they have to be prepared to do pretty much anything. It's been interesting you mentioned the $6 million man. Um, from a family royalty standpoint, we still get paid for that stuff. Universal owns the rights to the music itself, but we get half of what they get, which is a really good thing. Mark Wahlberg was scheduled to make a $6 billion man, and they've been talking about this for 20 years, but they were actually close this time. So I keep in touch with the Universal guys to see if they started, and they said no, it's still in post production. And of course, then COVID came, so
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen with it. But I was telling some of my students actually yesterday. He did a show called Longstreet. It was a guy named James Franciscus. He
Hmm.
was a blind insurance investigator, and he was covering this guy that was in jail, but he was a trumpet player. So they had this scene where they said, you know what, Albert, we really need some music for this trumpet player to be thinking about and playing in this cell. You got guys in the soundstage, everybody sitting there. he sits down and just starts, and he has to come up with something immediately for the producer to be able to make this scene work. And so he really honed his craft with that stuff. When he first went to Hollywood, Monk, is really interesting. He said he had no clue. Everything, you know, you got a soft whisper love song and everything's loud. Right? So
yeah.
he had to learn, but he had a couple of mentors, but one in particular, a guy named Stanley Wilson. He was the head of Universal Television, and Stanley kind of put his arm around my dad, and Stanley kind of took him under his wing, and he just kind of went from show to show to show, because Quincy had already been out there. Benny Carter was out there. JJ moved out there. Benny Golson moved out there. Tom McIntosh was out there, and a lot of those guys weren't even playing instruments anymore.
Right.
You know, they were composers. So Benny kind of gave everybody a start, because he was one of the first African Americans to go out there and compose. And then Quincy followed him, and Quincy got some really great breaks with The Pawnbroker and a lot of the movies that he got a chance to do. But Dad wrote the inside music for Ironside, because Quincy wrote the theme song for that. He wrote, I bet you, for 7-8 years. I mean, it might not have been that long, but it was a pretty long time. And that's the beauty of residuals. I tell my students that our portfolio, Naslin Music Company LLC, has got two components. It's got the jazz component, then it's got the television component. We don't control a lot with the television component, but the television component by far brings in more royalty money than the jazz component any day of the week and on Sunday.
I noticed,
you know, see it.
I came across a thing I had not been aware of a 1975 recording called Skull Music.
Or was it Skull Sessions?
Skull Sessions. Skull
Yes.
Sessions. And I noticed it said that some people have been sampling from that. Now, does the estate get compensation for that?
They do if we own it. That's the issue. To make sure that we own what they're sampling. See, because if they sample with Universal stuff, then we'll get some, but we get half of what Universal gets.
Yeah.
But if it's directly with me, and nobody's contacted me yet, and it's interesting how people don't contact you so much. I had this situation happen to me recently, and I'm going to leave this is a great pianist. He did an album with a lot of Dad's tunes on it. So he contacted me because I work with E-Jazz Lines, and he wanted to get permission to put his arrangements out. And they paid me a little bit for it, so it works out real well. Well, I never got clearance from the record company for the tunes originally. And it's amazing. And everything has gone dead since then. There's radio silence. You haven't heard anything from anybody. And this guy told me that, he said, well, you know, I thought the record company, he told me who the guy was. I thought the record company was supposed to do that. And they were supposed to do, but they haven't done anything. But my issue is, do I start to do copyright infringement? Because really, the only people that really make money of that is the attorneys.
Yeah, you just might give yourself more headaches.
Oh, yeah.
Did you
and
catch?
I did have one I have to share with you.
Okay.
Bela Fleck, the great banjo player, he did an album called Outbound. This is several years ago. So my attorney and I went to hear Bela play, and they did Hoedown. So Aaron Copland's Hoedown is owned by somebody else. So they did, you know, dee, and then in the middle of that Hoedown was my dad's Hoedown. So I said, well, this is a copyright infringement. So of course the attorney started calling, and 2 years later, I get a call at midnight from Bela in Germany. He said, Oliver, we really need to kind of work this thing out. So I said, well, let's do this, Bela. I said, you pay my attorney's fees. It was about $3,000 then, so it wasn't a huge amount, but it still was money. And I said, you come to Indianapolis, you record one or two of my dad's tunes, and you make sure that Sony, because he was with Sony at the time, Sony put something about my dad on that album. So we finally got it to work. Bela, my attorney now, drove down to Louisville, heard the show. They had, you know, the Wooten brothers were playing with him and stuff. It was great. Bela came home with me. We got home about 3 o'clock in the morning. My wife was watching TV waiting for me, and Bela said, well, can I sit down and watch TV with you guys? I said, sure. So we had a recording session at a place called the Lodge here in Indianapolis. About 9 o'clock, we went to the Lodge. I bought him some breakfast. We went to the Lodge. We recorded some tunes. J.J. Johnson's son, Kevin Johnson, actually played on that tune because J.J. is from here and Kevin lives here now. Played on that tune. I put Bail on a plane and sent him home.
Oh, now that was a civilized way to resolve that situation.
Well, you fight. What good is it going to do? You know what I mean? It just doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah.
And then I've had I had to learn the business of music on the fly because my stepmother basically controlled everything till she died. So then my brother and I took it over and I said, well, let's put an LLC together. So we put an LLC and we structured it a couple of ways. We structured it, first of all, that the ownership would be 51-49. So I would be the 51 part and he would be the 49 part. He didn't really like that, but what that did for me was allow me to be able to do anything with anybody anywhere without having to contact him to get his permission so I can make deals. And then we split the royalties 50-50. Well, I ended up suing one company because they weren't letting me exploit the music the way I wanted to. Of course, that took 2 years and we got about 90 grand out of that one. But my dad learned a hard lesson with the music, and I tell my students this all the time. He put out a piano book, and it had 11 tunes in there, one of which was Stolen Moments. Of course, musicians never know what their big hit's going to be, and his goal in the early 60s was to be published and to be recorded. I mean, that's what you do. So for $700, basically, he kind of signed the rights away for that stuff for $700. And Stolen Moments itself has brought in millions of dollars over that time span. So I had to sue these guys, and they paid us royalties for them, but you never know who's honest or not. That's the problem with royalty business. Who's really telling you the truth, telling you the true scoop about this? So I have to live with them. And actually, they got bought out. The company, Carlin America, got bought out by a company called Roundhill Music, which is owned by a bunch of investment bankers. So it's kind of, when Carlin owned them, it was really kind of music people. These guys now, they're just in for the money wherever they can get it. But they've been really good. And this is the first time that I've worked with a company that I've never talked to anybody physically. Everything is by email. You know what I mean? And the other company I could call if I wanted to talk to the head of accounting, where's my royalty check? I could call the guy and I knew who he was and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But actually, Carlton's, they bought Carlin America off for $245 million because they had stuff from James Brown, they had stuff from Elvis Presley, they had jazz guys, they had a lot of ownership of tunes.
So let me ask you, back to yourself, musically, what's your favorite thing to do?
To play. I like to play more than anything. But my dad told me something, and I never really thought about it. I'm starting to think about it more. He said, players come and go. You'll see great ones. But if you can write well, you can make it. And he found that out, and he was really unique, though, Monk, because he could actually play well, and he could write well. And see, some guys don't have the ability. Slide Hampton can do the same thing. Being able to play and being able to write so I need to really spend the time. I took some arranging classes in college, and I really need to go back. But writing is a craft, and it takes as much, if not more, time to write as it does to practice and play. So trying to justify that time is well, just when I did the transcriptions for my doctorate, it took forever. You're dealing with Sibelius, and you're going back and forth and trying to make that stuff work, and Hubert is playing all this stuff. Well, but I really want to get into writing more. I want to.
You know what you said about your father being able to play and write equally well. I'm thinking of this record, and
absolutely.
I've been revisiting this. I still hold on to my favorite LPs, and there's a quote from him in the liner notes. He said, "I get tired of all these guys having all the fun on my dates." So, he gave himself some solos.
That's right. And actually, his solos with Ron Carter and Steve Kuhn and those guys and Grady Tate were really great. He played
Yes.
well. But you know what I think helps, and I'm learning that Hubert actually told me this. He said, Dad played like a composer. So he was always thinking,
Yeah.
and and that's the thing, you know, some of us get up, we just start blowing the little licks that we've learned, and but to really think about what you're doing, and Jamie Abensold pushes that idea of really thinking about what you're going to play and how to structure it. And if you listen to what he did, he was always come up with a neat idea and he would not let it die before he worked it.
Well, go listen. I mean, I'm sure you've listened to this a few times. The original recording of Stolen Moments, his tenor solo on there, he's like, he's composing as he goes, literally.
Oh
And
yeah,
he's a
playing
theme.
triad pairs.
Yeah, beautiful. And
Oh,
it's such an interesting contrast. You know, you've got Eric Dolphy, who's like,
all over the place.
he's all over the place. And then I mean, I just wore it out.
Oh yeah. Interestingly enough, and this is another story. I'm sure that Dennis story. I'm full of stories here. I got a call from Jamie Abensold once, and he said, Jamie said, Oliver, did your dad write that solo out before he played it? And I was highly insulted by that. I said, of course he didn't. But he had been thinking about it a lot. He had been
Hmm.
thinking about what he wanted to do. He said, because that's almost a perfect solo. And it is. It starts simple. He builds those ideas. He goes up, and then he brings it back down again. It's just a magnificent study piece in the art of jazz improvisation to me.
Yes, it is. Were you witness to? I guess I'm wondering because he did so much, and you know, he'd had these assignments. How did he conceive of new themes? Did you ever
He
witness?
was.
Go ahead.
I actually witnessed it a couple of times, especially with the television stuff. He was doing an Ironside once, and there was a race thing in there. We're sitting in the pool. He kept a little piece of paper, and he was thinking about the, and he said, you know, I got an idea for this. And he scribbled some stuff because he had perfect pitch, so
Oh,
he knew exactly what he was writing all the time, and he came up with some pretty creative stuff. Plus, he was influenced by a lot of the great classical composers. He did a solo on an out on all the way, and I was trying to think of it was Moodsville. It was one of his early Prestige albums, and Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra. I can't remember movement. Do do dee do do dee 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 do do dee 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 dee. Well, he started his cadenza with that. He changed keys. He did all kinds of different, and it was really cool. When I first heard it, I said, "That's Bartok," but he was really influenced by a lot of those guys. So he would take a lot of time to come up with different stuff. And I think the Hollywood stuff really helped him because he did a movie called Skullduggery with a young Burt Reynolds. It was not a great movie, but he had to think of some ideas because this was about the missing link in Australia. And he wrote a tune called Afrique with Count Basie, and he actually used that theme and made a tune out of it.
uh-huh. He must have always been thinking about something musical, I would guess.
Always, but you know what? The the interesting thing about Dad was kind of like me. If you gave him 4 weeks for a show, he would never start on it 4 weeks before. He always did his most creative stuff when he was under the gun.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes he would write 16, 17 hours. I try to stay up with him. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. He's finishing up because he never allowed anybody to orchestrate. He did all that stuff himself. So he would come up with the stuff, write it out. He was very meticulous and very thorough about how he lined his paper, everything. So 5 o'clock in the morning, he's finishing the last score for a scene. We drive to Universal Studios because this was before emails and sending files. Drop it off, go back home, take a shower. The copyists have got it by 6. At 8 o'clock, musicians are sitting on the sound stage, and he's got to conduct all day.
Oh my Lord.
Oh, so it was a really pretty tough schedule, and he learned that you're no better than your producer. If your producer does not like you, you're done.
Wow. Now, did he write with on a score pad? Did he use a pencil?
Yeah.
Okay.
These little scripto mechanical pencils that you would.
Yes.
He had a million of them, and he had them, and he used those all the time. And it's funny, I still have some of the old manuscript paper. You can't even find this stuff anymore.
Yes.
Now you got 8 by 10 sheets with a million ledger lines on there, and you're trying to read the score. But see, back in those days, you had big scores, so you could actually
Yes.
see that stuff and read it.
I have a pile in my basement if you're interested.
Nobody uses that stuff anymore.
Yes. Oh, gee. And I just like to think, nowadays everyone's at a computer, but the physical act of putting a note on the paper, it's sort of like you're really invested in it.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
you know.
oh yeah, and I learned that lesson the hard way. Up at 2, 3 in the morning, copying drum parts by hand in an arranging class. I said, this stuff is crazy. But the interesting thing is, he knew the transpositions. He had a little cheat sheet, Monk, that he used for the alto clef of viola every
Oh,
now and then.
yes.
He pulled that out, but he knew all the transpositions. And the guys today, if they write a score, it's in concert,
Right.
and then somebody's got to transpose it. He never. Everything was written out exactly the way it was supposed to be.
Wow. I bet the copyists liked your father.
Oh yeah, they really, and he was very neat. It's interesting. I don't know if you read. There was an article that Creed Taylor did on Dad, and he was talking about Impulse when he first started out, because that was Blues in the Abstract 2 was one of the original 8 albums that they did. Train had one, JJ had one, and actually there's an anniversary set that you can buy with the 8 albums on there. And Creed was saying that there was a difference between him and Gil Evans. Dad was very meticulous, very neat, and Gil was all over the place.
What about what about song titles? Did he ever have music that he had written, original music, that he had trouble thinking, what do I call this?
Well, it's interesting. He would think of those when they had to go on record. But I've got a ton of scores of M201s,
Yeah.
M302s, and that kind of. And I have to sit down and figure out a lot of times what they were, and some of this stuff has never been done. So I've got boxes and boxes of music, and I've had one of my students kind of help me catalog stuff. But then COVID came around, so she can't even come to the house
Yes.
anymore.
Wow.
So, but most of the stuff he had a good name for. That book of 11 songs, he had one called One for Brucey. That was my nickname, Brucie.
Ah.
And my mother got this name from a kid on TV that she saw. So the name just kind of stuck with me and my family, but nobody else knows me by that, but family members. Teeny's Blues and Miss Fine, they were both written for his sister, Leontine Lacoste. She was a pianist, and she played. She did the piano bar thing in St. Louis, and they loved each other immensely, but would fight like cats and dogs at the same time. But both of those, because my aunt was a very elegant person, so that's why he called her Miss Fine. He wrote that big band arrangement of Miss Fine for her, and then Teeny's Blues, of course, came off the Blues in the Abstract 2 album too.
In our collection at the college, I have a score your dad did for Joe Williams, and so nothing seemed to faze him. I wonder, did he seem compelled to take every offer given to him?
I think in Hollywood he was afraid not to take offers, because my stepmother would always say, we've got enough money, you don't have to work anymore. But I think his point was out of sight, out of mind. So you kind of had to keep the system rolling there as far as doing stuff, and that didn't help him. Plus, he wouldn't go to the doctor. All the reports you probably read say he died of a heart attack, but he didn't die of a heart attack at all. He died from pancreatitis and metamorphosis of the liver, which are both alcohol related. And I tell my students this all the time. I said, you know what? You can't do that. because your problems don't go away the next day. They're still there, and a lot of times they're worse than that. But you try to drown your personal sorrows and all that stuff with alcohol, and it just doesn't do any good. And I think if he had taken better care of himself physically that way, he would have been okay. I think he might have been a little afraid to go to the doctor personally. This is just my personal opinion.
Uh-huh. Did he and your mother or your stepmother encourage you? Well, how did they feel about you pursuing music as a career?
Well, my mother was fine with it. Actually, when I was going to college, Dad wanted me to go study with David Baker at IU, but my mother, because she's a Seventh-day Adventist, very church related, she said, "No, send him to this church school." Well, he did it the first year, and then the second year. By the fourth year, he had kind of given up. So I kind of learned stuff on my own. I had a really good ear. But actually, this experience that I had at Illinois, I learned more about music there than I ever learned in my life. And I wish I could have started learning that earlier. Just the intricacies of improvisation, what you have to do, all the transcriptions we have to do in order to be able to sound good, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of guys with really good ears out, but everybody can't be an intricate improviser. Some people, you have to work at it. You have to really study the guys and work at it, and then you'll get your own sound eventually. But you sound like them sometimes before you get your own sound. Yeah. So I'm learning that on the other end, but that's okay. Life is going pretty well. Like I said, I love teaching, even though I'm doing Zoom teaching. I usually buy bagels for my students every semester. I can't buy bagels from this.
Yeah, you just have to eat it in front of them, and boy, I wish you could share in this.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
But, encouraging young people, to me, is a privilege, because a lot of these kids have no clue, like I said before. And I told them, I said, my class is important, but I'm more interested in your character and your integrity and your development as a person. If you do that, that's all I care about. In my jazz for listening class, I said, my goal for you is this. If you're at a restaurant with your parents and you hear Take the A Train, and somebody says, well, that's Duke Ellington's Take the A Train. He said, no, that's Billy Strayhorn's Take the A Train that Duke Ellington did. If you got knowledge like that, or if you're in an airport and you hear, oh boy, that sounds like Professor Nelson's dad's Stolen Moments. That's what I'm looking for those kids, to introduce them to the music and to keep that little flame going.
I'll drink to that.
Yes.
But not too much.
That's right, not too much. You got to be careful with it.
Do you have your own, I mean, you pretty much just said it. Do you have your own opinion on the jazz education as a whole in the United States? It's certainly a big business, and there's a built-in issue with all these graduates. What are they going to do in a business that isn't as robust as the education?
And I think you said it best when we were talking before, you said this, you've got to be versatile. See, the days for me, if I could go out and play post bop like Joe Henderson, those guys, that's the music that I really love. You're not going to eat on that. You got to find a way to eat, man. So if Kanye's got something and he needs a saxophone player to come in and play something, you got to be able to play with him. Or if the symphony is doing a Ravel piece and they need a saxophone player, you need to be able to do that. Or if there's a wedding coming up and you know what, well, I really don't like to play wedding, but it pays a couple of $1,000, you'd be a fool.
I'll be there.
That's right. So they've got to look, and they also need to look at skills like writing. I think the guys that are successful can write a little bit. They play. They're versatile in a lot of the different things they can do, because the purists, or the guys that have the big names and big jobs, is less than 1/10 of 1%. The Wintons and those guys, they're a very tiny part. Of course, everybody wants to be like that. But my friend Kevin said, his dad, JJ, says, he said, the stars only fall on a few, and he's right. So what can I do to make a living doing what I love to do every day? And that's kind of what I challenge them with.
Well said. Was it a big decision, are you aware of, when your family relocated? Now, you were in New York for a while, is that right?
Yeah, Dad was in New York for a while.
Right.
But always wanted to be a composer in Hollywood. That was something that he always wanted to do. You know, the Marconis and the Newman brothers and all those guys, Hollywood was where he really wanted to go. So he got an agent, and he lived in the Beverly, oh, what was it? The Beverly Hawaiian Hotel. I can't remember the name of it. It's been so long ago. Bought a Yamaha Spended piano there, got an agent, started putting a portfolio together, and the first thing that he wrote for was called I Love a Mystery. And I remember, I can remember some of the songs, and then they'd have love scenes in there. And so he had to shop this stuff around. And of course, Benny Cardinal's guys helped him too. And he got that introduction to Universal. And that kind of got him in the door. But I always say that Dad was really good, but he was very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. Because in the 60s then, they were looking for African-American composers. They were looking for guys that could write. You know, that was back in the black.
Why?
Blacks.
Can you tell me why?
Because there is the. I think part of it because of the race issues that were going on in the middle 60s. You know, black equality, all that kind of stuff. And Hollywood said, well, I think we can make some money on some of this stuff. So they had the Shaft movies come out, and a lot of that stuff came out. And so they were looking for African Americans to be able to write for that stuff. So he happened to be lucky, but also he was good enough that he could transcend anything. So if they needed a string quartet for a scene in the morning, he could write a string quartet. They needed a big band in the afternoon, he could write for a big band. You know, you talk about Westerns. I'd never known how those little pianos that you hear in the bars, tack pianos, they put tacks on the hammer.
Right.
And I'd never been exposed to that. Also, Dad was the guy that introduced synthesizers to Universal Studios. He was writing for them. They didn't even have one. Benny Golson had a portable, and they had to rent Benny Golson's portable Moog and bring it in because Dad had some stuff. And you listen to the $6 Million Man, all those sounds, he actually created those at home himself.
No kidding. Turning the dials and all that stuff.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
I'll be darned.
Yeah, he created, and of course, Universal owns those, so they get they get royalties from that kind of stuff too. But he had a Moog synthesizer, and he actually went to New York and met Robert Moog himself to learn. And back in those days, everything was monophonic. So you got phase shifters, and you got sine and sawtooth waves, and so he was making those telephone patch cords, and he'd make them himself. So you could plug one into the other. He bought a Ampex 8-track tape recorder in the 60s. That thing was $20,000. I never forget.
Oh, my God.
And it had inch-thick tape on there, and it had cell sync. So you could record over yourself, and it would synchronize with everything else. So he was doing all that kind of stuff.
Where did he learn his craft as far as just writing a big band arrangement? Was it just listening?
Well, he actually studied with a guy named John Cotter, who was he was the musical director for Della Reese, and he learned a lot of the big band stuff there. And then he worked with a lot of the regional bands, Jetterpellers, and a lot of the bands in the St. Louis, Kansas City area. There were several funeral directors, and I can't remember some of the names of some of these guys, but they had big bands and Dad played there. So he learned how to write there. But in order to be able to write Stravinsky, Schoenberg, that kind of stuff, he went to school, and that's where he went to study at Washington University.
Okay. I just wanted to tell you that I don't know if you know that your father made the 1960 edition of Leonard Feather's book.
Oh yeah, Leonard Feather loved my dad, man.
Yeah. It mentions that he was a cab driver and studied taxidermy, perhaps.
Yep, he studied taxidermy for a while. Thought about going into undertaking business. And actually, he wanted to get his pilot's license. I don't think he never did that, but he had a lot of interest. But one of the big things he did for leisure was model railroading. He would build these elaborate train layouts. He actually built one for me personally, and I didn't take care of it very well. But he had the mountains and all that stuff. Went to Japan and bought brass engines and brought them back. And he was really, because his father was a Pullman porter on the railroad. So trains had always been a part of his life, and he loved model railroading. So he was a tinkerer. He could take your timing belt out of your car and fix that if you needed it to be done. Just a really, really interesting guy.
What kind of things? I'm going to ask this of him, and then I'm going to ask it of you, so you have a chance to
Okay.
think.
Okay.
What kind of thing would make your father angry?
Um, Probably lack of preparation for musicians when that he had to work with.
Hmm.
He would get really pretty upset about that. Um, it's funny you mentioned sound pieces. Well, the sound the piece itself was pretty difficult with the bass clamp.
Yeah.
Well, they couldn't play it when they first were recording. They couldn't play the piece. He sent them home,
Wow.
and they came back, and they had to play it the next day. Um, so that stuff, and then the racial situation in the country really got him upset.
Hmm.
There's a place in St. Louis that you wanted to get a hamburger, but black people had to go around the back, and he really couldn't stand that kind of thing. That's why the album he did, Black, Brown, and Beautiful, was so significant, because he learned a couple of things. One thing he learned was that was at a time when Africa was the motherland for us African Americans here in the United States, but the Africans didn't claim us. We were Americans, and
Hmm.
he learned that pretty quickly. He said, we have put stock in this country, and we have to be proud of the stock that we have put in this country. And then he did a piece called "Self Help Is Needed." Actually, the IU band is going to play that. I just gave some music to the IU guys a couple of days ago, and I wanted them to play it, especially during these racial times, because we cannot wait as African Americans for the federal government to do anything. You got to do some things yourself. I believe it should be peaceful. I believe it should be organized, but you can't wait for others. You have to go on. And he was really into that kind of thing a whole lot.
It's wonderful to hear. And how about yourself? What gets under your collar?
Um, Not much. I'm pretty. Um, I'm challenged right now because I have an 87-year-old mother that lives with me, and she's got dementia.
Hmm.
So sometimes we were up there today, and she has not been able to go to church. She's a big church goer. Been doing all. She said, "We going to church today?" I said, "No, Mom." And of course, she'll ask you that 50 times. So
Yes.
having patience to deal with that is tough. And her situation, she can still dress herself. She can still, take baths. She can still do
Yeah.
stuff. But it's just challenging to go through that a lot.
Sure.
So that, and it's not angry necessarily, but this is a lady that graduated from high school when she was 15, graduated from college when she was 19, has two master's degrees, one in Spanish and one in counseling, but dementia doesn't care.
Yeah.
It, it, it,
Didn't
it
didn't your mother get multiple degrees also?
yeah,
Masters
this
or?
is my stepmother didn't, but my physical mother did.
Uh-huh.
And so that's what I'm talking about. So
Yes.
she's staying with me now, and my dad taught me something because he made sure that he was going to take care of his family. He built a house in Wentzville, Missouri, for his mom and dad, and he made sure that as his success rose, that he made sure he took care of them. We were really, really a pretty close family.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that kind of challenges me a lot. The racial situation challenges me. I have a son who's an attorney, and actually, this is interesting. When George Floyd was killed, one of his clients saw the police and stuff dealing with George Floyd before he was murdered. And my son had an interview with Chris Cuomo on CNN, and he was very eloquent. My dad would have been very proud of him
I see.
to do that kind of stuff. But living as an African American, even at 65 years old, I'm suspect to get stopped at any time. I
Yes.
mean, and that is awful.
We are in the midst of a historically turbulent year in so many ways. Are you a spiritual man?
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about why all this is occurring now?
I think, and I'm just going to go from my Bible reading and that kind of stuff that I do a lot. The Bible talks about these kinds of things happening, but I've never seen it to this degree before in my life. And I've talked to a lot of people that are a lot older than me, and they said they've never seen anything, because the Bible talks about pestilence, it talks about famines, it talks about earthquakes, it talks about all this kind of, and we're having all this stuff right while we speak. So from a spiritual standpoint, and I'm a believer in eternity and that kind of stuff. So it's just kind of pointing to what is going to happen in the future, and that's just my personal opinion. I talk to my students sometimes. Of course, you don't want to talk religion too much at school. I kind of keep away from that. But basically, they have no use for it at all. A lot of them don't. Because they've seen the hypocrisy from parents and, you know, from other people of, if you're a believer in Christ, what Christ would do versus what you see. And one thing that really does get me angry is the evangelical right and the embracement of a guy that has no moral background too much at all. And I'm just speaking, this is just me talking. And there, you know, it's like the Pharisees of old. They killed Jesus, and some people are looking the other way. This guy, as long as you can get your agenda taken care of, we don't care. And it drives me nuts.
It drives me nuts too. And I guess sometimes people say, well, it's all about as long as they get the conservative judges they want or something. But that seems like a poor excuse to me.
It's a real poor excuse. And young people see that phoniness, and they don't want to have any part of it. And that's the thing. It really bothers me. If something gets me angry, that gets me angry more than anything else. And now we don't know how the election is going to turn out. I'm going to go vote early.
Yes.
and I'm going to do my little 2 cents and put because that's all you can do. But you know what I try to do in my classes, and we talk about, I said, you guys go out and vote. See, the last time young people didn't vote.
Yeah.
And they got to go out and vote. You seeing all this unrest, but the beautiful thing about, especially the racial unrest, is the joining of African Americans and white Americans and all that. It's a beautiful sight. When Dr. King did his speech in 60, you didn't see that. But today, I mean, it's just a beautiful rainbow of people out there that are all striving. And to me, that's what this country is all about.
That's hopeful.
Yes.
Thank you for saying that. I wanted to read a couple more quotes.
Okay.
First of all, name this tune. You ready?
Okay.
You
Yep.
have to forgive my vocalizing.
That's all right.
Ba da 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 da.
Da 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 da. From the Kennedy Dream.
I love it. And Nat Hentoff, who wrote more than one set of liner notes for your father over the years,
Yeah.
he was talking about sound pieces, and he said, there are no arcane implications to this music, followed by your father saying, it could be for trombone and snare drum. So my question is, and it's sort of a broad question.
And I answered that wrong, by the way, but that's okay.
Yes, you knew it was sound pieces, yes.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact,
And actually, it was written for French horn. If you listen to it, and he had French horns playing really high on that thing.
Yeah.
The Smithsonian did it, and some of the guys were scuffling.
You know, I'm sort of not glad. I find that interesting. Also, the fact that you said in the original session the Cats like couldn't cut it, because we tend to think that at that level they're infallible. They can just play any. People like to say, first time perfect, right? Not necessarily so.
No, and if the music is tough, you gotta woodshed that stuff just like anybody else does.
Yeah. Okay. Now I think I lost my question. Actually, this is something I think about a lot. What does music mean? And when he called it sound pieces, he could have called it something descriptive. He could have dedicated it to something, but he called it sound pieces, just like Samuel Barber called that beautiful piece Adagio for
For
strings.
strings. Yeah.
Right. So I'm struggling to ask my question, but does music have to have a deeper meaning other than it's just beautiful music?
I think it does not. I think it can just be beautiful. If you read the liner notes on that album, you see what he said. He said, "Why did you name that sound?" He says, "It's a piece that sounds." That's what Dad. That's what Dad quoted in the on. And I think that's what he was thinking about, just beautiful sound and stuff. We would. This is really interesting, but we would get together sometimes, and he and I would cry just about beautiful sounds that we would hear and beautiful pieces that we would hear and that kind of stuff. So beauty to him musically was a big deal. Now some things had special meaning. If you look at the Kennedy Dream, and I was thinking about the Kennedy Dream,
Yes.
all those pieces had a certain meaning. I mean, they were all written for a certain thing, but that sound piece was just a creative idea, and that's why I think he loved Bob Thiel so much, because Bob would give him creative license to do pretty much anything he wanted, and Dad was lucky that he could get people to play instrumentations, flute salad. Who's got 4 alto flutes? I mean, especially back then. Now you can find them today, but back then, who's got 4 alto flutes? So
Yeah.
he would, and then you got a big band with French horns. You hired more people to come in to do this stuff. But Bob loved him enough and knew what he could do that he would give him license to be able to write pretty much what he wants to, which is a
That's
really
great.
neat thing.
I get such a charge out of still reading the personnel on music that came out of Los Angeles at that time. And you just, I mean, I write arrangements too, and I sometimes think, oh my God, if I could have that assemblage of people and have them play a chart of mine, that would be like so
Oh yeah,
incredible.
and this was normal stuff for him. I
Uh-huh.
mean, Buddy Collette, Bud Shank, Tom Scott, all those guys, Bobby Bryant on trumpet. I mean, Garnett Brown on trombone. Shelly Manne played with him all the time.
Yeah.
Ray Brown played with him a whole bunch of the time. So that was just kind of his normal his normal set of people to play his music.
Would he come home and talk about his day?
Come home exhausted sometimes, especially with the television stuff.
Yes.
He said, man, I don't want to hear another note for a long time.
Mm.
That would last about 2 days. And then he said, well, I'm ready to get back to work, ready to get back. And everybody needs to get away from that stuff. Because it's a factory. I mean, it literally is a factory. You kind of put this stuff out and you got to do it within a certain time frame. And you got to make sure it's right. And the technology was so different then than it is now. I'm going to see if I can point something to you. I'm going to turn the screen around.
Yeah.
If you look, you see that big brown clock up there?
Go a little higher.
Okay, there it is.
Yeah, a little higher.
Okay.
Okay, got it.
That clock was the clock that he used to write music for Universal, for television. Because what they would do back then was they would give a cue sheet out, and the cue sheet was all timed to 1/10 of a second. So the $6 Million Man throws this ball at 2 minutes, 22 seconds, and the ball goes slow. And he'd have to use that clock to time everything to 1/10 of a second. When you went to the sound stage, they had a big clock like that too. And what they would do is the music editors would have to use a thing called a streamer. So they scratched the film because you had this big movie screen there, and they would tell him when the music started, and it would tell him when the music had to stop. So he had to use that clock to be able to write that stuff.
Wow. And I bet you wouldn't want to be the person in the band who made a real clunker.
Oh no. You really wouldn't. But you know what? He tried to conduct, and he found guys that would really work well with him. So that actually, I was talking. Who was I talking to? Oh, what was Sheridan Stokes is the flute player, and he did some stuff in California with Dad. And one time he said, well, they needed somebody to play timpani. Well, Dad went back and played the timpani. So you do whatever it takes to make make the
Yes.
deal work. And
Yeah,
he
that's
used a
great.
lot of different interesting people. Carol Kay, remember the Rat Pack Carol Kay that did all the stuff with the kids?
Sure.
Well, he'd write parts off a Fender bass. He called it a Fender bass, and he'd have parts for her to play the Fender bass on it. But it was an interesting time because Ray Brown had a bass in every studio. The horn players, Bud Shank and those guys, they had a cartage service, and they would actually have this service come and pick their instruments up and take it to the next studio. So they didn't even lug horns anymore.
Uh-huh.
And they would, I mean, they were making really pretty, you know, you make $250, $300 for 4 hours, then you go to another studio and you do that. And I was telling my students, we talking about how much guys for television make today. Dad was making about $3,000 a show. And it was a 26-week season back then. So it was a lot longer than it is today.
3,000 a show. What is that? How is that divided up into like services?
So you'd come and you'd write the music and you conduct the music, and they have a check phone for $3,000.
I see.
And so you'd have 26 of those $3,000 going, and then they'd have him do other projects. So then he had the jazz stuff he was still doing, plus he was doing that. So he was actually making $250,000 to $300,000 a year back in the 70s.
Wow.
So he was doing real. And
go ahead.
no, he was doing real well, and he needed to turn some stuff down, but he didn't. He just wanted to keep that old ship running, because you never know when it's going to dry up. So
yeah. Did he ever recycle themes, like write something for a show and didn't really fit? 2 years later, say, "Oh, I got something for this. I already."
Oh yeah, I mean, composers love the sound of their own selves. So. And actually, he used some of those things for different. Like I said, the Afrique album. If you listen to Afrique, that was from a television.
I see.
And so he would, and all those guys do that kind of stuff. So you recycle some stuff, but then he was always trying to find different stuff too. He studied with a guy named George Trimley, and George Trimley was working with Quincy and a lot of the guys out there using 12-tone techniques. So he really got into serial composition and 12-tone techniques, and the retrograde and all that kind of stuff. He really got into that. If you look at his patterns for improvisation, there's a 12-tone Rowe that he's got, and I can't remember what exercise it is now, but I was just playing it the other day. So he really wanted to get into that. I'm gonna digress 1 second. You said something that he really would get him angry. One thing that would get him angry was being recognized not just as a jazz musician.
I see.
And that would bother him. That bothered David Baker too, because David was a tremendous writer. He could write anything. But, they always wanted to pigeonhole the African Americans into this kind of hole. And then they would only call them, like if the symphony wanted something, they would only call them doing Black History Week.
Right.
And that would get him upset, because he probably would have won a Pulitzer Prize, but they weren't giving those out to African Americans back in those days.
Yeah, even
And
Ellington,
that would get him upset.
I see. What's in the near, well, I have to stop this question. I was going to say, what's in the near future, but none of us know.
We don't know.
As educators, we're all in this same Zoom world, and some of us are making it through better than others, I guess.
Well, it's interesting. A guy named Brent Walderab, he's one of the teachers at IU. He teaches arranging and composition and stuff. He's doing this concert of my dad's music, and asked me to play on it. And I wanted some of my I wanted some of my Jazz for Listeners students to come. Well, I talked to the head of the department. He said, well, I have to check and see, because they might not let you. And these guys are having rehearsals, and everybody is so separated. Yes. So he's trying to put them in clusters kind of close together so you can get a blend, because you can't get a blend anymore. The orchestra down there, all those guys is doing Zoom. The jazz guys with with big bands are able to have rehearsals, but the whole room is all spread out. So
Yeah.
everybody.
You know, I have a nine member saxophone ensemble, and they constantly are slowing down, and I'm going, what's the problem? Well, they're 60 feet from one end to the
That's
other.
right. So how do you hear? Yeah, you can't hear.
Yes.
I was looking at the Green Mill in Chicago, great jazz club. They opened back up and they said, you know what, no horn players and no vocalists.
Really?
Yep.
Oh, because
And
of
I
the
don't know if
aerosol.
well, I thought it was a Green Mill because I saw the Green Mill did the same thing too. But no vocalists and no horn players.
Wow.
So how you going to run a club like that? I mean, it's just, but you know what? You're blessed, Monk. I feel I'm blessed too, to be able to have a teaching gig.
Yes.
And,
exactly.
yeah. I mean, that brings still money into your coffers, and that's a good thing to have.
Yeah.
And today, like you said, you got tons of guys. I remember 10 years ago, there were not a lot of doctorate in jazz studies. Now there's a ton of them, and everybody's looking for work.
Right. When's
And
that guy going to retire?
Don't do it anytime. You know what? My philosophy of retirement is I probably never will.
Yeah.
As long as I can still play and do that kind of stuff. And for me, music is to touch the lives positively of others. Mm-hmm. Clark Terry said something once, I'll never forget it. He said, you know what? I want people to feel better when they leave than when they come in.
All right. Well, that sounds like a good note to wrap up with. And I've so much enjoyed this conversation. I had a feeling I would.
Well, did you get enough information?
I did. We might have to do part 2 down the road.
That's fine. And I got more stories for you if you need to. I just really appreciate you thinking of me and Dennis thinking of me. So it's always an honor to talk about this helps keep his legacy alive.
Yes.
And that's the thing that's very tell me about your school and tell me about your archives if you can.
Well, Hamilton College is a very old college. It goes back to the early 1800s. It's a liberal arts school. It's small. It's a gorgeous place, a nice place to work.
How many music students do they have?
We don't have many music majors. We have a nice crop of talented students. We have about 6 professors.
Great.
This project I do came about because Hamilton grad of the class of 1944 was a very enthusiastic supporter of swing music and jazz of the 30s through the 50s. Sure. And he decided that many of his musical heroes were passing away without having their stories told. So I lucked into the job of starting to do videotaped interviews, and we decided together we focused on people with the Basie Orchestra first, because Joe Williams, the singer, helped us get started.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So we've been at it since 1995, and we've done 400 plus video interviews. It's been a dream gig for me, I'll tell you that.
Oh, you can't beat that, man.
Yeah.
You can't beat getting paid for doing this.
That's right. Wait a minute, you mean I could get paid for this?
Oh, that's right. So what do you teach?
I teach saxophone lessons and an ensemble, and the archive job is a half-time job for me at the college, so I'm there like 65%.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and it gives me time to play gigs. Not right now, but
right. When is the last gig you played?
The last gig I played, I've played about 4 times since the end of February. And I used to play 4 times a week.
Oh yeah.
So,
well, and it's awful. I was thinking about some of the guys that came to Jamie's camp. A lot of those guys had contracts to do shows, Broadway shows, and they're not doing anything.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend of mine the other day. The Indianapolis Symphony canceled all the health insurance for all the orchestra members. Oh. So it's just hard times, man. I've never seen anything like this ever.
This is definitely the blues.
Oh yeah. Oh, I did. A friend of mine we've been doing some streaming of shows outside in her backyard. So I went down and played that. And then there's a guy that wants me to come up and do a jazz clinic in Minnesota. but you know, you don't even know if you're going to have this stuff.
Right.
You know, gin is supposed to be in Louisville. I don't even know if they're going to have gin.
Yeah.
You don't. So everything is kind of up in the air.
Definitely. Well, let's hope for the best. Be positive, as you have said a number of times today.
Oh, yeah. And this is really giving me a chance to try to get my skills. You know, it gives you a chance to kind of do some stuff that you wouldn't necessarily have time to because you were too busy doing other things.
Yes.
So I'm trying to work on my piano chops, and I've been going through Mark Levine's jazz theory book for this class that I've been teaching, and trying to boost myself up.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much for asking me, and just give me a call. By the way, I sent that information. I sent it to you.
Yep, I did
Okay.
get it.
Okay. But if you want to do something else, just let me know.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, man.
See you on the flip side.
Yes, sir. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.